My big toe is strongly related to two main aspects: consciousness and the virtual reality. Okay, and that is related to the simulation concept too. What do you see is the role of quantum physics in relation to both concepts and my big toe? Why of the question here? Okay.
Well, quantum physics is real important because that is the first time once we actually started, quantum physics started with the double slit experiment. The double slit experiment gave birth to quantum physics. And the double slit experiment is a very important experiment because it shows, I should say scientifically, but experimentally, it demonstrates, and it's been done over and over again by thousands of people in hundreds of universities. So it is the real deal. That's the way things work. And it shows that there is a connection between consciousness and reality. It shows that our reality is not materialistic. It's not a material world, because, well, maybe I should mention the experiment a little bit first, just very, very quickly. If you take a particle, and any kind of particle, it can be a particle of light called a photon, or it could be an electron, or it could be a big buckyball, which is a molecule of carbon. It has 60 carbon atoms in it. So it could be a big particle, little particle, or light. If you take a particle and if you throw that particle or shoot that particle at a background, at a board, say, and the board has two holes cut in it, two slits cut in it. Well, what you expect if the world is a physical reality is that those particles will go through one slit or the other and pile up behind that slit. So say there's a screen or something on the other side of the slits. So the particle goes through the slit and it will run into the screen that's right behind the slit. So you end up with a bunch of particles on the screen behind either slit. That's what happens in a physical world. Well, what the double slit experiment showed is that when you fired particles between those slits, that if you don't know which slit each particle went through, that's called the which way data, which way the particle went, which slit it went through. If you don't know that, then the slits do not pile up behind each slit. If you don't know that information, those particles spread out in a line. You'll get a whole series of lines, and there's places between the lines that don't have any particles at all in them, and then other places where there are particles. And you get a pattern on your screen. It's called a diffraction pattern. Sometimes it's called a wave pattern. It's the pattern you get when waves are from two sources interfere with each other. It's also called an interference pattern. That's what happens. But yet these are particles being thrown through the slits. No other force is operating on that particle. Newton told us if a particle's traveling in a straight line and it's not impacted by any outside forces, it'll continue to go in that straight line. Well, these particles are going in straight lines. There are no other forces, and they somehow, rather magically, rearrange themselves on the screen in a diffraction pattern. Well, that was a mind blower when that happened. And then they found out that if they did take a detector and discover which slit each particle went through, then the particles all pile up behind the slits, and you get a pile of particles, behind each slit. Well, what that said is that the difference was information. The difference there is, one, you had no information about the which way data, and secondly, you did have information about where that particle was when it went through that slit. Okay, that's the only difference. So that let scientists know that our reality is based on information. The way our reality works is different depending on the information that is available. Okay, and that was kind of an astounding thing. Well, worlds that are physical and objective don't act like that. That just doesn't happen. So this quantum mechanics experiment told scientists that what we thought we knew about reality wasn't right. Now, it probably was approximately right. You see, it was a good approximation because those theories work pretty well. Newton's theories work pretty well, but they're only approximately right. Like you had Newton's mechanics, And everybody thought that was the truth. And even they were so sure of it, they called them Newton's laws, like the law will never be violated. And then when they found quantum mechanics, well, there it was. It violated the law. There was no force on those particles, but they redistributed themselves in a diffraction pattern anyway. So Newton's laws were wrong. But they still work pretty well most places. It was only in the realm of the very small that quantum mechanics weirdness seemed to take place. And then physicists thought, well, there's kind of a different physics for small things than there is for big things. Well, that's kind of silly. There's only one science. There's only one physics. You just have to understand, you know, what's going on. So as it turns out, when you understand how quantum mechanics works, you will see that the very same science exists in both, in the small realm, the micro realm, as well as the macro realm. It's not that there's two physics for, you know, a physics for small things, a physics for fast things, and a physics for you know, everyday things. Like that. Yeah. One physics covers them all once you really understand it from a fundamental viewpoint. You see, relativity was seen as the physics of fast things. And quantum mechanics was the physics of small things. And then Newtonian mechanics was the physics of everything else, you know, the everyday things. So there is only one physics, and it explains all of those things. Okay, so quantum mechanics was our first realization that science had that our idea of a deterministic, materialistic, objective world was wrong. At the very basic, it's wrong, because science has it that the bigger things are built up from the little things. Well, if the little things are information-based, then the bigger things that are built up of the little things are also going to be information-based. So that was the first time that scientists got that idea. Unfortunately, they didn't have at that time any of the concepts that they needed to solve that puzzle. They didn't know what to do with it. I mean, we have all sorts of quotes from the guys who invented quantum mechanics. You know, Niels Bohr and Einstein was part of that group, and there's a whole lot of them. Planck, you know, Max Planck, and so on. This whole group that were really the fathers of quantum mechanics. You have all sorts of quotes from them saying things like, "Well, we know that information and consciousness have something to do with it, but we just don't know how to express that. We have no idea how to put that into mathematics. You know, it's just we don't get it." And they were very excited about a whole new science being generated. But after spending years and years and years banging their head against that wall without making any progress whatsoever as to understanding it, mostly scientists gave up on it and said, well, it's just weird science and nobody will ever understand it. So stop trying, you know, shut up and calculate, you know, a famous quote from a quantum mechanics theorist that I guess, anyway, so that's been the attitude of scientists, that it's just something that nobody will ever know and forget about it. So they did forget about it. So 100 years later, see, that was done in like 1920s, that quantum, you know, that double slit experiment, and quantum mechanics was born like 19 probably 18 to 1925, you know, in that range. Well, here we are at 2020, almost 100 years later. And scientists still aren't any closer to understanding this than they were 100 years ago. They're still totally baffled by it. And the reason they're baffled by it is they didn't take the hint that a reality is information-based. They didn't know what to do with that. What do you do with that fact? A reality is information-based, not determinist physical-based. Well, what does it mean that a reality is information-based? Well, what that means is that it's calculable. You can calculate it. It's information. It's about information, right? Well, we know that our reality is very mathematical. You know, physics uses mathematics as a tool to describe reality, and nobody knows why is that. Why is our reality so amenable to being described by mathematics? Then you understand that it's information, Well, it's a very small jump, and I don't make the jump. I do the logic to get there, but it's a very small jump to realize that this is a information-based reality, which means it's a computable reality. It can be computed, which is the same as saying that it's a simulation. Our reality is basically a simulation, or could be simulated. Let's put it that way. And that's the same as saying it's a virtual reality. It's information-based. It's not physical stuff-based, it's information-based. That makes it a virtual reality. So that's the idea. And from that idea of it being a virtual reality, you can understand it from that perspective. Quantum mechanics and relativity just fall out logically. They're no longer weird science once you take the idea that this is a virtual reality and understand what's that mean. Well, they had one other fact there too, and that was consciousness seemed to be involved somehow, because when consciousness got that which way data, it changed the result on the screen. Without the which way data, you get a different result. So the fact that consciousness was involved in it in some way, in getting the which way data, that confused them very much too. But the idea is that consciousness is an information system. You see, think about what you're conscious of. Well, you're conscious of whatever your sense data is. You have senses, right? You hear, you smell, you see, you can feel. You have all these senses, and all of those senses are just information. They're data. So your reality is information that comes to you through your senses, and that's it. If you took away all of your sense data, what would your reality be like? You'd be at the Descartes moment. You'd be, aware that you exist and nothing else. I think, therefore I am. I am, therefore I think. Either way, that's all you would be an awareness that you exist. If you took away the sense data, there'd be no sight, no smell, no touch, no sound. You see? So that the fact that consciousness is information, consciousness gets the data, has to get the data to affect the way the reality is rendered. Well, that means, or I shouldn't say it means, but that leads the pointing finger to consciousness is the computer. Consciousness is where this virtual reality is being rendered. It's being rendered in consciousness. Then you realize that we're not physical bodies. The physical bodies are avatars. We are consciousness. And because this is a virtual reality that's rendered, then the computer can't be inside the reality that it's rendering, right? That's just very simple third grade logic. The computer that renders a virtual reality can't be in the virtual reality that it's rendering. It has to be outside the virtual reality. So now we realize that we are consciousness, not bodies, and that consciousness exists outside of this virtual reality. See, that brings us to a whole lot of just logical conclusions, and they're all right there in that double slit experiment. It's telling us that. Well, I didn't start there. I started from the very basic, from a very basic set of ideas and derive all of that. So I didn't just use the double slit to jump to this conclusion. I didn't jump to the conclusion at all. I derived it piece by piece. I'm just now, to keep things shorter, I'm just kind of jumping into the middle and telling the way it fell out. Yeah. You see, that's easier to do. So that's why the double slit is so important. It was the first time that science experiment revealed to us just exactly what this world was all about, that it was a virtual reality computed in consciousness. And once you have that understanding, then all the quantum mechanics and relativity and why the speed of light's a constant just falls out as trivial logic. Couldn't be any other way. And you can look at all the quantum mechanics experiments, all that weird science, and all the weirdness disappears. So that's why the double slit is such a big deal. And quantum physics is a big deal, because since that double slit experiment, there have been hundreds of other experiments that have shown the same thing. It's not just this one experiment is weird, but there's lots of weird quantum mechanics out there, and all of them work from the same basic principles. You see, it all is understandable if you have the right perspective. So that was a big moment in history in the 1920s when the scientists thought they had a whole new science right at their fingertips, but then it just stalled out because they didn't have the concept of a virtual reality. And right now, of course, virtual reality is a common word. You know, a lot of movies are based on it, and you know, it's an idea that's around. So we can think that thought now where they couldn't back in the 1920s. And let's say 2 decades from now, when virtual reality games and experiences will be part of our teaching, part of our training, part of our life, everyday life, this idea that we live in a virtual reality will be a simple idea to get. Now, when you tell people, particularly older people, you know, people my age and your age, that you live in a virtual reality and it's computed, they go, oh, bullshit, that couldn't possibly be true. That's crazy.
I can feel it.
Yeah, I can feel it.
Solid.
This is me. Yeah, they, you know, they have that reaction, but that's just because they've grown up in a world that was material and deterministic. And kids 2 decades from now will say, this is a virtual reality? Yeah, that makes sense. It's not going to be a big deal. But back in 1920 something, it was impossible to even think of that. The concepts weren't there. That's why these hugely brilliant scientists at that time, you know, the Heisenbergs, the Born, the Planck, Einstein, all of these guys just banged their head against the wall trying to figure that out and came up empty, because the concepts of virtual reality just weren't there yet. It wasn't an idea. 2 decades from now, it'll be an easy sell. This idea that this is a virtual reality will seem obvious, if not trivial. Now, most people, particularly older ones, kind of shake their heads and say, that's crazy. You know, how could that possibly be? But if you think about it a while, you realize that if it's a virtual reality or not a virtual reality, it's going to look exactly the same to you, you know, if you were being here. So if it looks exactly the same, then what really differentiates the two? Well, one of them is that if it's a virtual reality, you can understand quantum physics and relativity. And if it's not, you can't. So that tends to lead some credence to the fact that it's a virtual reality.
That's an interesting thing. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. People tend to, when they hear that you say something like simulation or virtual reality, then it's not real. No, it doesn't change anything. It just explains how it works. And
Yes.
it keeps having the same purpose it had before. The same day yesterday you didn't know anything about this, and you thought it was real. It is still as real as it was. It's just a bit explained now.
Exactly. And it's an explanation that works,
Yeah,
rather than
yeah,
one that doesn't work. Yes,
yeah.
that's the difference. If people say, well, it's just a virtual reality, then it doesn't make any difference. No, there is nothing more real than information.
No. And then the next step, people trying to say, let's try to escape of this. It's not real.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the next thing they try to think about.
Yes. That's just,
I knew it was too bad to be real. We need to get out of this.
yeah, if it's not real, then how do I get out? Right.
Okay.
Well, that's a big question. How do you get your elf and your wizard out of World of Warcraft into the Sims? You know, how do you do that? Well, it's not an easy thing to do. When you're inside of virtual reality, that is your reality. And in any case, yes, people just have a very hard time getting their minds wrapped around this concept. It just seems so incredulous. You know, it just couldn't possibly be that way. But not only is it that way, but in just a few decades, it'll be obvious, it'll be trivial. People won't have a hard time getting their heads around it because they will have been immersed in virtual realities that they couldn't tell any difference between that and this one. And that's going to be common experience in a couple of decades. They will have gone in and out of virtual realities that all seemed, one just seemed as real as the other. And this one that we call our physical, you know, reality in our physical universe is going to be no different than the other ones they get into. They're all going to be of about the same quality. And when you've had that experience, this idea that this couldn't possibly be a virtual reality kind of just goes away. You don't have that issue anymore. You realize that, yeah, this could be a virtual reality. Matter of fact, thinking that it is a virtual reality is the only thing that actually lets you understand how things work here.
Yeah, and most of all, the important thing here is the best you understand how this works, how the system works, how the game works, how are the rules, how can you play best there, you know, you can have a better life, the best you
Yes.
understand it. It's not the ignorance that will take you anywhere. The best you understand the rules of the game, the best you can play and you can live. They are synonyms here. Huh?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Instead of wandering around in the playing field, you know, totally clueless as to what the game is, you know, that doesn't get you very far.
That's ugly.
People, yeah, that's people who are struggling and having a lot of negativity in their life and so on. Once you understand how the game works and you're able to, you know, to play it the way you're supposed to, then you start to find happiness and joy. Your relationships get better. Everything starts working for you because you are actually making progress in your game. You're leveling up, you know, so to speak, and everything gets easier and better and more satisfying. So, yes, just wandering around clueless in the playing field is not a good way to run your life.
Okay.
And so, I'm looking forward to seeing Brazil and having some fun and meeting a lot of great people there.